Introduction. A celestial tremor rends the silence, saturated with the holy aroma of frankincense, myrrh, and cassia, as if the Lord himself calls me to rectify this sacred omission with fervent dedication. Have you ever felt your soul quake under the weight of an unfulfilled divine mandate, as though a heavenly voice compels you to rise and complete the sacred task laid before you? Behold the astonishing and awe-inspiring truth that reverberates through the ages your spirit, forged in the crucible of unseen and relentless battles waged across the vast and mysterious spiritual realm, stands under the protective and omnipotent shadow of a divine guardian whose might can shatter the mightiest of earthly empires with a single, decisive, and righteous stroke of justice. Yet herein lies the paradox that perplexes and challenges your vulnerability. Born in the frail and trembling clay of human frailty and weakness is the very sacred and hallowed ground where God's omnipotent and limitless power manifests to defend his chosen and beloved people with an unshakable and mighty hand that never falters or wavers. From the spiritual heights beyond the ethereal veil that separates the seen from the unseen with a dividing curtain, a voice descends with a thunderous and majestic resonance that shakes the foundations of heaven, echoing with the timeless and eternal authority of the ages, past and future, marking you as a witness to the angel of the Lord since the dawn of your faith with a divine and indelible seal that endures through eternity. What if the trials you endure with a burdened and weary heart, the rejections you've faced with a wounded and scarred spirit, were not mere hardships to bear with stoic endurance, but a divine and holy consecration to recognize with discerning and perceptive eyes the divine hand that guards you against overwhelming and insurmountable odds with a protective and saving shield? This revelation draws you into a sacred and transformative odyssey of the soul, where the fragile and deceptive veil of the earthly conceals a celestial war of cosmic and eternal proportions that rages with unseen fury. And every breath you draw aligns with the rhythmic and sovereign will of the Almighty, a will that guides with unerring and perfect precision through the storms and trials of life. The air thickens with the soft, ethereal, and harmonious chant of angelic hosts singing praises to the Most High with a celestial and glorious chorus. A chill brushes your skin like the gentle and protective wing of a guardian spirit watching over you with vigilant and loving care. And a soft, radiant, and living light pulses with a divine and eternal glow, beckoning you to behold the awe-inspiring and righteous might of divine justice with a contrite, seeking, and humble heart that bows. Is your soul courageous enough to stand in reverent and trembling awe of the angel who struck down 185,000 in a single night with a flaming and avenging sword? A testament to God's unyielding and righteous power that never fails, wavers, or diminishes. Part 1, The Shadow of the Siege. Envision a night where the celestial vault above seems to hold its breath in a tense and expectant silence that hangs heavy with anticipation, the stars casting an ominous and foreboding glow over the trembling and ancient walls of Jerusalem. A prelude to a divine and mysterious secret about to unfold with a hidden and sacred purpose that awaits with bated breath. This is the shadow of the siege, the first sacred and portentous sign of a celestial drama where the mighty and omnipotent hand of God prepares to move with a decisive and powerful stroke, altering the course of history with a divine and transformative turn that shifts. Have you ever felt a shiver of awe and wonder course through your being with a trembling and awestruck spirit as history pivots on the hinge of a single and fervent prayer, as if the very air itself holds its breath in anticipation with a pregnant and suspenseful pause that builds with tension in the year 701 BC, under the steadfast and devout reign of King Hezekiah, a man of deep faith and unyielding courage? The small and beleaguered kingdom of Judah faced the relentless and merciless might of the Assyrian Empire, a formidable and terrifying force that devoured nations like a ravenous and insatiable beast with a devouring and unsparing maw that consumes. The Assyrian king, Sennacherib, a figure of pride and unchecked power that swells, led an immense and vast army of 185,000 soldiers, their dark and threatening banners waving like a tempestuous and violent storm under the scorching and unrelenting sun of Judah. their siege approaching the holy and sanctified city of Jerusalem, the last unyielding bastion of faith against the tide of pagan domination, with a defiant and resolute stand that holds. 2 Kings 19:35 hints at the unseen and mysterious with a cryptic and veiled voice that whispers, "And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. A verse that hints at a divine and supernatural intervention with a hidden and powerful hand. Can you sense the divine and omnipresent presence gathering its strength in the profound and unnatural stillness with a gathering and mighty force? A stillness that prepares for a divine act. A chilling and spine-tingling tale emerges from the shadows of a forgotten and ancient memory that lingers. Hezekiah, a descendant of the great and anointed King David with a royal and sacred lineage that traces, whispers a desperate and heartfelt plea in the hallowed and sacred silence of the temple. His faith a radiant and piercing beacon that cuts through the oppressive darkness with a guiding and illuminating light, while deep within the sprawling and chaotic Assyrian camp, officers toast their impending and arrogant victory with raised and boastful cups, blissfully unaware of the avenging and righteous angel's silent and deadly approach with a concealed and flaming sword that strikes. The narrative weaves with a cautious and expectant thread that builds with suspense. Danger looms with a threatening and oppressive shadow that darkens. But divine protection stirs with a protective and vigilant wing in the quiet and expectant night that waits. The wind ceases its gentle and soothing rustling with a fading sound, the air growing heavy with an unnatural and foreboding silence that presses down with a weighty and palpable presence, a sensory omen of the impending and righteous judgment that awaits with a trembling and divine hand that moves. Does your soul dare to feel the electric and charged tension of that fateful and transformative night with a quivering and awestruck spirit? A night that changes the destiny of nations with a divine shift. This siege is more than a mere and earthly military threat that endangers. It is a spiritual and cosmic battleground where the steadfast and unyielding faith of one righteous and devoted king challenges the overwhelming and prideful arrogance of an empire with a defiant and holy stand. A battle where the stakes are eternal and everlasting with a divine and sacred purpose that endures. The enemy, with a cunning and malicious intent that plots, seeks to crush Judah's flickering and fragile hope with a crushing and devastating blow that destroys. But God, in his infinite and merciful wisdom, prepares a deliverance beyond human comprehension and understanding with a saving and redeeming grace that uplifts. Have you ever felt the divine and palpable anticipation before a miracle unfolds with an eager and hopeful heart? An anticipation that stirs and awakens with a living breath. The story deepens with added layers of richness and a depth. Hezekiah's council debates surrender with fearful and uncertain voices that waver. Yet his unshakable and steadfast faith holds firm with a resolute and unyielding stand. A faith that invites the divine and miraculous intervention with a beckoning and divine call that summons. The air hums with the deep and resonant scent of impending judgment that looms with a heavy presence, a sensory prelude to the angel's descent with a divine and striking force that moves. Part 2. The Faith of Hezekiah. Picture a king kneeling in the shadowed and sacred sanctuary of the temple with a bowed and humble form. His voice a fragile yet resilient and unwavering thread of hope, woven against the deafening and prideful roar of Assyria's arrogant and boastful pride. His unshakable and steadfast faith, a mighty and impenetrable shield raised against the encroaching and suffocating despair that threatens to overwhelm with a dark tide. This is the faith of Hezekiah, the second sacred and luminous sign of divine favor bestowed upon the righteous and faithful with a blessing and anointing hand, a favor that shines with a radiant glory. Have you ever clung to a prayer with a desperate and pleading grip when all earthly and fleeting hope seemed lost and extinguished with a fading and dimming light? As if a heavenly and attentive ear, inclined to hear with a listening and compassionate heart that cares with love. Hezekiah, having purified the land of Judah of its corrupting and idolatrous idols with a cleansing and purifying hand that sweeps, and restored the broken and shattered covenant with a renewed and devoted spirit that mends. placed his unwavering and steadfast trust in the one true and living God of Israel alone with a trusting and believing heart, a trust that stands firm and unmovable. Isaiah 37:15-20 records with a sacred and prophetic voice that proclaims his poignant and fervent prayer that rises with hope. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, deliver us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord, even thou only, a plea that ascends with a lifting voice. His deep and abiding devotion stands in stark and radiant contrast to the haughty and blasphemous arrogance of Sennacherib, who boasted with a proud and defiant tongue of conquering nations without the hindrance or interference of any divine power, with a mocking and scornful claim that challenges. Can you hear the echo of his plea resonating through the corridors of time with a timeless and enduring sound that calls? A sound that reaches a haunting and soul-stirring story unfolds from the depths of a sacred and ancient history. Hezekiah, in a moment of anguish and profound despair, with a grieving and broken spirit, tears his royal and regal garments with a rending and mourning hand at the receipt of Assyria's blasphemous and mocking letter, spreading it before the altar of God with a submissive and humble spirit that bows. His tears a glistening and sacred testament to a faith that endures with strength and resilience, a faith that pleads with fervor and passion. The story flows with a gentle and hopeful cadence that lifts with grace his trust in the Almighty, invites a divine and miraculous intervention with a saving and redeeming grace that restores. The air grows warm with the rich and aromatic scent of incense rising with a fragrant and holy offering that ascends, a sensory sign of his holy and unyielding resolve that strengthens with a firm and unshakable stand. Is your heart ready to mirror his unwavering and steadfast faith with a trusting and believing soul that holds fast? A soul that trusts. This faith is a spiritual anchor that steadies with a firm and unyielding hold, a light that guides through the darkest and most oppressive night with a leading and illuminating beam that shines, a light that holds with firmness and strength. The enemy, with a malicious and deceptive intent that plots, seeks to break this faith with a crushing and devastating blow that destroys. But God, in his infinite and merciful wisdom that overflows, honors it with a powerful and sustaining strength that uplifts with a saving and redeeming hand. Have you ever felt the divine and empowering strength in prayer with a lifted and hopeful spirit? A strength that uplifts, sustains, and restores. The narrative expands with added depth and richness. Hezekiah's counsel wavers with fearful and uncertain voices that tremble, but his unshakable and steadfast faith prevails with a resolute and unyielding stand that holds, a faith that summons the angel of deliverance with a divine and holy call that beckons. The air pulses with the deep and resonant scent of devotion that anoints with a sacred oil, a sensory call to trust with a faithful and believing heart that endures. Part 3, the Assyrian Threat. Envision an army resembling a plague of voracious and destructive locusts descending with a consuming and insatiable hunger that devours. Their war machines poised with a menacing and threatening stance to crush the sacred and hallowed walls of Jerusalem. Their pride, a raging and destructive storm, unleashed against God's chosen and beloved city with a violent and unrelenting force that strikes. This is the Assyrian threat, the third ominous and foreboding sign of human defiance, raised with a rebellious and proud hand against the divine and sovereign authority of God, with a challenging and mocking voice that defies. Have you ever felt the crushing and oppressive weight of an enemy's arrogant and boastful pride, with a heavy and burdensome load? As if their haughty and scornful claims challenge the very authority and power of the divine, with a defiant and blasphemous shout that roars Sennacherib's sprawling and ruthless empire, stretching with a greedy and expansive reach from the rugged and towering mountains of Persia to the fertile and lush plains of Egypt, raze cities to the ground with merciless and unsparing force that annihilates. His formidable and vast army of 185,000 soldiers, a metallic and unrelenting tide that surges with a crushing and overwhelming wave that engulfs. Isaiah 36:4-10 records with a prophetic and warning pen that writes the taunting and scornful words of Rabshakeh, the Assyrian spokesman, as he mocks Hezekiah's God with a blasphemous and mocking tongue that spews, "Whereon do ye trust? that ye abide in the siege. Behold, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed. Egypt, a challenge that echoes through the ages with a scornful and derisive laugh that taunts. Their overconfident and blind assurance deafens them with a closed and stubborn ear to the omnipotent and unassailable power of the divine that looms with a threatening and righteous presence that judges. Can you sense the swelling and prideful pride that provokes the righteous and holy wrath of heaven, with a trembling and shaking ground that quakes with divine anger? A chilling and terrifying tale arises from the ashes of a conquered and devastated past that lingers. Refugees from the fallen and ruined city of Lachish stumble into the gates of Jerusalem with dust-covered and blood-streaked faces that mourn, crying out with anguished and desperate voices of destruction and annihilation that wail. They come like a storm with a furious and destructive wind, while Assyrian emissaries stand beneath the city's towering and ancient walls, mocking with a cruel and derisive laugh that jeers, their arrogance a prelude to an impending and certain doom that awaits with a falling and crushing shadow that looms. The narrative weaves with a cautious and foreboding thread that warns with a prophetic voice. Their overwhelming and oppressive threat ignites a divine and powerful response with a striking and avenging hand that moves. The air carries the sharp and metallic scent of war's imminent and deadly approach, with a clashing and resounding sound that echoes, a pungent and alarming warning of their reckless and prideful folly that blinds with a darkened and unseeing sight that falters. Does your spirit brace itself with a steadfast and unyielding stand that holds for the judgment their pride invites, with a falling and crushing weight that judges? A weight that falls. This threat is a spiritual and cosmic assault that challenges with a defiant roar, a direct challenge to God's sovereignty and divine rule, with a rebellious and proud heart that defies. A challenge that provokes the Almighty's response with a righteous and holy anger that burns. The enemy, with a cunning and malicious intent that plots with a scheming mind, revels in their strength with a boastful and arrogant chest that swells. But God, in his infinite and merciful wisdom that overflows with grace, prepares a counterstrike of divine justice with a saving and redeeming blow that strikes. Have you ever felt the demo and palpable tension before the judgment falls, with a tense and expectant spirit? A tension that builds and prepares with a gathering force. The story deepens with added richness and depth. Hezekiah's counsel made debates with fearful and uncertain voices that waver with doubt. But Isaiah's prophetic and comforting words steady them with a calming and reassuring hand, a steadying that foreshadows a victorious and triumphant outcome, with a divine and holy promise that endures. The air hums with the deep and resonant scent of conflict that clashes with a warring sound, a sensory prelude to divine and righteous action with a striking and avenging force that moves. Part 4, the prophetic promise. Imagine a prophet's voice cutting through the thick and suffocating veil of fear with a sharp and piercing blade that severs the darkness. His words a lifeline of hope, extended with a saving and compassionate hand from the throne of God, promising deliverance against all earthly and insurmountable odds, with a divine and unshakable assurance that holds. This is the prophetic promise, the fourth luminous and reassuring sign of divine assurance bestowed upon the faithful and righteous, with a comforting and sustaining hand that uplifts. Have you ever held fast with a clinging and desperate grip to a prophetic word when hope fades into the shadows of despair, with a dimming and fading light? As if God's sacred and holy word alone sustains your spirit with a sustaining and life-giving breath that revives and restores. Isaiah, with eyes burning with divine and unquenchable fire that flames, and a beard white with the wisdom of countless ages that teaches, declares with a thunderous and authoritative voice that resounds with power, he shall hear a rumor and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Isaiah 37:7. A promise fulfilled with precision and divine accuracy on that fateful and transformative night, with a striking and avenging stroke that judges. His sacred and prophetic vision of an angel's swift and silent descent with a hidden and powerful wing offers a beacon of hope to a trembling and fearful Judah, with a guiding and illuminating light that shines. A hope that pierces the darkness with a radiant beam. Can you feel the divine and unshakable certainty in his prophetic and commanding voice, with a steady and reassuring tone that comforts? A tone that strengthens and upholds. A haunting and awe-inspiring story emerges from the sanctity and holiness of prayer, with a sacred and hallowed space, Isaiah, prostrated with a humble and submissive heart that bows before the altar of God, is enveloped by a supernatural and blinding light that fills the sacred and hallowed precinct with a radiant and glorious glow that dazzles with brilliance. Receiving God's holy and divine word with a trembling and reverent spirit that shakes, to comfort and strengthen King Hezekiah with a divine and prophetic message that uplifts and restores. The story advances with a hopeful and uplifting cadence that rises with grace. Prophecy transforms into a living and vibrant reality with a fulfilled and sacred promise that endures with strength. The air pulses with the pure and uplifting scent of sanctity that anoints with a holy and fragrant oil that blesses. A sensory sign of the promise that stands firm with an everlasting and aromatic fragrance that lingers. Is your heart open to trust with a believing and faithful soul as a prophetic word spoken in the midst of crisis and despair with a hopeful and seeking spirit? A spirit that clings with faith. This promise is a spiritual anchor that steadies with a firm and unyielding hold that grips. A word that guides through the storm with a leading and illuminating light that shines. A word that holds with unyielding and enduring strength that supports the enemy with a malicious and deceptive intent that schemes with a plotting mind, seeks to drown this promise in a sea of doubt with a drowning and overwhelming wave that engulfs. But God, in his infinite and merciful wisdom that overflows with grace and love, fulfills it with a powerful and sustaining strength that uplifts with a saving and redeeming hand that delivers. Have you ever felt the divine and comforting peace in the assurance of prophetic words with a peaceful and tranquil heart? A peace that steadies and calms with a soothing balm. The narrative expands with added depth and richness. Isaiah's counsel calms the king with a steadying and reassuring voice that soothes, a calm that precedes the angel's divine and miraculous strike with a holy and avenging blow that strikes. The air vibrates with the deep and resonant scent of prophecy that anoints with a sacred oil, a sensory call to faith with a trusting and believing spirit that endures. Part 5, the angel's descent. Envision a luminous and ethereal figure descending from the lofty and majestic heavens, with a graceful and powerful glide that moves. Its presence a silent and unstoppable storm that rages with fury. Its flaming and radiant sword, a blaze of divine justice, unleashed against the formidable and vast force of 185,000 strong, with a striking and consuming flame that burns. This is the angel's descent, the fifth awe-inspiring and majestic sign of divine justice, executed with a righteous and avenging hand that judges with fairness. Have you ever imagined with a wondering and curious heart an unseen and mysterious force altering the course of human history with a single and decisive act that turns, as if the mighty and sovereign power of heaven intervenes with a divine and holy will that commands with authority the angel? A being of pure and radiant light that blinds with glory and boundless energy that surges with power, strikes with a silent and invisible force that moves with stealth, fulfilling the sacred and prophetic promise of 2 Kings 19:35 with a divine and authoritative decree that proclaims, "The angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. Its awe-inspiring and overwhelming power reduces the mighty and proud Assyrian might to a hushed and lifeless silence with a quiet and final end. A testament to God's unwavering and protective defense of his people with a shielding and saving hand that guards. Can you sense the profound and reverent awe with a trembling and worshipful heart of its invisible and devastating strike that falls with precision? A strike that awes and humbles. A chilling and terrifying tale unfolds from the darkness and shadows of that fateful and decisive night. Assyrian guards fall silently with a soundless and sudden drop that shocks with surprise. Officers collapse mid-sentence with unfinished and stilled words that fade into silence, their voices silenced with a quiet end, as the angel moves like a luminous and ethereal mist through the sprawling and chaotic camp, With a graceful yet deadly and unerring stride that strikes with accuracy, the narrative weaves with a solemn and majestic thread that binds with strength. Divine justice prevails with a striking and righteous blow that purifies. Justice that cleanses and restores. The air chills with the eerie and haunting scent of death's profound and absolute silence that envelops with a heavy and somber cloak. A sensory mark of the judgment that falls with a divine and heavy hand that judges with equity. Does your soul stand in awe and reverence with a worshipful and bowing spirit of this celestial and mighty executor that smites with power? An executor that glorifies with holiness. This descent is a spiritual and cosmic triumph that conquers with victory. A breathtaking and awe-inspiring display of God's infinite and holy power that awes with wonder. A display that humbles with reverence. The enemy, with a fearful and trembling frame that quakes, trembles at its approach with a quivering and terrified spirit. But God's unassailable and sovereign will triumph with a victorious and unyielding stand that prevails. Have you ever felt the divine and majestic grandeur in this act of justice with an inspired and uplifted heart? A grandeur that inspires and elevates with glory. The story deepens with added richness and depth. The angel's light briefly blinds Sennacherib with a flashing and blinding glare that stuns. A glimpse of impending and certain doom that looms with a dark shadow. A doom that awaits with judgment. The air hums with the deep and resonant scent of divine wrath that burns with a holy fire. A sensory sign of victory that proclaims with a triumphant and resounding voice that echoes. Part 6. The Dawn of Deliverance. Picture the first golden and radiant rays of sunrise piercing the darkened and oppressive horizon with a breaking and illuminating light that shines, revealing a vast and silent field of fallen soldiers with a still and peaceful presence. A silent and victorious testament crafted under the mighty and omnipotent hand of God. A dawn of miraculous and awe-inspiring deliverance that shines with a glorious and triumphant radiance. This is the dawn of deliverance, the sixth radiant and triumphant sign of divine victory bestowed upon the faithful and righteous, with a saving and redeeming grace that restores and uplifts. Have you ever witnessed with your own eyes the aftermath of a divine and miraculous intervention with a seeing and awestruck spirit? As if God's omnipotent and limitless power rewrites the fate of nations with a divine and guiding pen that directs with purpose. The morning light unveils with a revealing and bright glow 85,000 lifeless and still forms with a peaceful and quiet repose, bearing no wounds or signs of struggle with a calm end, as Isaiah 37:36 confirms with a prophetic and authoritative voice that proclaims, "Then the angel of the Lord went forth, and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000, a fulfillment that stuns and amazes with a divine and holy act that astounds. Hezekiah's steadfast and unyielding faith, a faith that stands firm and resolute, is vindicated with a righteous and just reward that blesses. The holy and sanctified city of Jerusalem saved with a divine and protective shield that guards with strength. Can you feel the overwhelming and joyous relief with a rejoicing and grateful heart of this deliverance that saves and frees? A deliverance that liberates. A haunting and awe-inspiring story arises from the stillness and quiet of dawn. With a sacred silence, sentinels atop the ancient and towering walls of Jerusalem watch with wide and astonished eyes that marvel the camp's eerie and unnatural stillness that perplexes with wonder. The king beholds the miracle in a profound and reverent silence with a bowed and humbled head that submits, his heart filled with wonder and awe that overflows with gratitude. The story flows with a triumphant and exultant cadence that rises with grace. Deliverance crowns the faith that endures with a victorious and radiant crown that shines with glory. The air brightens with the fresh and invigorating scent of dawn that awakens with a new and hopeful day. A sensory sign of victory that celebrates with a joyful and harmonious note that sings with praise. Is your heart ready to rejoice with a singing and praising spirit in God's mighty and protective defense with a grateful and thankful heart? A heart that worships and exalts with adoration. This deliverance is a spiritual and transformative awakening that enlightens with a guiding light, a powerful sign of God's unbreakable and eternal covenant that binds with a sacred and holy tie, a sign that uplifts and restores with a healing and redeeming touch. The enemy's wicked and malicious plans crumble, with a falling and shattered ruin that collapses. But God's sacred and holy promise stands firm with an unyielding and victorious stand that prevails. Have you felt the divine and overflowing joy in this act of salvation? With a joyful and exultant spirit, a joy that multiplies and blesses with abundance. The narrative expands with added depth and richness. The people gather with united and harmonious hearts that beat as one. Their songs a living and vibrant testament to their enduring and steadfast faith. A faith that triumphs with a victorious and resounding stand that echoes. The air vibrates with the sweet and uplifting scent of liberation that frees with a liberating breath. A sensory call to praise with a worshipful and adoring spirit that glorifies. Part 7, the retreat of Sennacherib. Envision a king fleeing in abject and paralyzing terror with a trembling and shaken frame that quakes. His pride shattered into countless and broken fragments that scatter. His once mighty and invincible army reduced to a fleeting and fading memory that vanishes. A retreat ordained by the divine and righteous judgment with a just and avenging decree that strikes. This is the retreat of Sennacherib, the seventh humbling and sobering sign of divine justice executed upon the proud and arrogant with a falling and crushing hand that judges. Have you ever seen with your own eyes the humbled and broken fall of arrogance with a witnessing and seeing spirit? As if God's sovereign and unassailable will overturns the grand and boastful plans of men with a divine and overturning power that prevails with victory, Sennacherib, spared by an inexplicable and merciful act of divine grace with a sparing and compassionate hand that relents, orders a hasty and panicked retreat with a fearful and quaking voice that trembles. His royal and deceitful scribes falsifying the history of the event with a lying and deceptive pen that conceals to preserve his tarnished and ruined honor. Sahak Kings 19:36. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, and went and returned, and dwelt at Nineveh, a retreat that marks the undeniable and triumphant victory of God's supreme and holy power, with a conquering and victorious spirit that triumphs. His overwhelming and paralyzing fear becomes a stark and undeniable testament to the omnipotent and unchallengeable power of the divine that prevails with a mighty and unyielding stand that holds. Can you sense the divine and guiding hand steering his flight with a directing and unerring force that leads? A force that humbles and breaks with justice. A chilling and terrifying tale emerges from the chaos and ruin of defeat with a haunting and mournful echo, Sennacherib, his hands trembling with a quaking and unsteady grip that shakes, avoids the gaze of the dead with a turned and averted face that flees. His wise and prescient counselor's earlier and ignored warning, echoing with a haunting and prophetic voice that haunts and torments, as he commands a swift and desperate departure from the field of divine and righteous judgment with a fleeing and broken step that runs. The narrative weaves with a solemn and cautionary thread that warns with a prophetic and guiding voice. Divine and holy judgment follows the path of defiance with a striking and avenging blow that strikes. Judgment that falls with a heavy and just hand that weighs. The air carries the sharp and acrid scent of fear that permeates with a bitter and pungent taste, a pungent and alarming sensory sign of his ignominious and shameful retreat with a fleeing and shattered spirit that collapses. Does your spirit recognize with a discerning and perceptive eye the justice of God manifested in his humbled and shattered fall with a fallen and broken crown that crumbles, a crown that falls? This retreat is a spiritual and profound lesson that teaches with wisdom, a humbling of pride with a broken and contrite spirit that bows, a lesson that instructs and guides with a steady hand. The enemy's boastful and arrogant pride fades with a vanishing and fleeting echo that dies. But God's righteous and unassailable justice endures with an everlasting and triumphant stand that prevails. Have you felt the divine and satisfying fulfillment in this act of judgment with a just and righteous heart? A fulfillment that rights and restores with equity. The story deepens with added richness and depth. Sennacherib's generals falter with a trembling and uncertain hand that wavers, their grand and boastful plans undone with a falling and shattered ruin that collapses. A undoing that reveals the supreme and omnipotent power of God with a divine and illuminating revelation that shines. The air hums with the deep and resonant scent of defeat that lingers with a heavy weight. A sensory call to humility with a bowed and submissive head that yields. Part 8. The celebration of faith. Imagine the holy and sanctified city of Jerusalem alive with the vibrant and joyous sounds of songs and heartfelt praises that resound with a harmonious chorus. Tears of joy replacing the bitter and anguished tears of fear with a flowing and healing river that cleanses. A spontaneous and exuberant celebration of unshakable and enduring faith that echoes through the ages with a triumphant and exultant voice that sings. This is the celebration of faith, the eighth radiant and uplifting sign of divine faithfulness, extended to the righteous and faithful with a loving and compassionate hand that blesses with grace, a hand that gives. Have you ever felt the communal and overwhelming joy of a divine and miraculous intervention with a united and harmonious heart that beats as one, as if God's boundless and infinite love unites his people with a binding and eternal cord that binds with strength? The people of Judah sing with exultant and joyful voices the sacred and holy words of Psalms 126, when the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion. We were like them, that dream. As 2 Chronicles 32:22-23 records with a prophetic pen their deep and sincere gratitude with a thankful and praising spirit. Hezekiah offering treasures with a generous and giving hand that blesses. A living and vibrant testament to the rich and abundant reward of their enduring and steadfast faith with a faithful and unyielding stand that holds. Their collective and heartfelt faith is richly and bountifully rewarded with a divine and holy blessing that overflows with abundance and grace. Can you hear the resounding and harmonious songs of gratitude rising with a joyful and united chorus for us that sings with praise? A chorus that exalts a haunting and soul-stirring story unfolds from the dawn of a victorious and glorious day. Mothers dance with liberated and free steps that rejoice, their faces alight with joy and radiance that shines with glory. Men embrace with tears of relief streaming down their bearded and weathered faces with a flowing and healing stream that mends. The entire and holy city of Jerusalem vibrates with a symphony of worship that echoes through the ancient and sacred stones with a resounding and holy sound that reverberates with praise. The story advances with a triumphant and exultant cadence that rises with a lifting and joyful spirit. Faith brings forth a celebration that glorifies with a praising and worshipful voice that exalts with adoration. The air fills with the sweet and uplifting scent of joy that rejuvenates with a refreshing and life-giving breath that restores. A sensory crown of faith that uplifts with a steady and rejoicing hand that blesses with grace. Is your heart ready to praise with a singing and worshipful spirit God's mighty and protective deliverance with a grateful and thankful heart? A heart that worships and adores with reverence. This celebration is a spiritual and transformative renewal that refreshes with a new spirit, a powerful sign of God's unbreakable and eternal covenant that binds with a sacred and holy tie that holds. A sign that uplifts and restores with a healing and redeeming touch that mends. The enemy's crushing and malicious defeat fuels their joy with a victorious and triumphant flame that burns. But God's boundless and infinite love sustains it with an enduring and unshakable strength that holds fast. Have you felt the divine and unifying unity in this praise with a united and harmonious spirit? A unity that strengthens and binds with a holy bond. The narrative expands with added depth and richness. The Levites lead songs with a guiding and worshipful voice that directs. Their music a living and vibrant testament to their enduring and steadfast faith. A faith that triumphs with a victorious and resounding stand that echoes with glory. The air vibrates with the sweet and uplifting scent of worship that anoints with a sacred oil that blesses. A sensory call to rejoice with a praising and adoring heart that glorifies. Part 9, the legacy of the angel. Envision a story etched with divine and meticulous precision into the sacred and hallowed scrolls of Scripture with a careful and inspired hand. A lasting and enduring legacy of the angel's awe-inspiring and mighty power that astounds, inspiring generations with a living and breathing tale that speaks with a prophetic voice. This is the legacy of the angel, the ninth enduring and powerful sign of an eternal and sacred witness preserved for all time with a divine and holy record that endures with strength. Have you ever drawn courage and strength with a bolstered and fortified spirit from the ancient and miraculous deeds of old, with a remembering and honoring heart, as if their divine and holy power lives on with an enduring and unquenchable force that persists with vitality, recorded with meticulous care and divine accuracy in the sacred and prophetic books of 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah with a pen that writes with inspiration. The angel's mighty and awe-inspiring deed, Isaiah 37:36. Then the angel of the Lord went forth, and smote 180,000 fuels in unwavering and steadfast faith that stands firm. Even as the kingdom of Judah later strays into the wilderness of idolatry with a wandering and wayward heart that falters and turns. This sacred and holy legacy stands as a beacon of light through the ages, with a guiding and illuminating flame that shines with radiance. Can you feel the enduring and unshakable strength with a fortified and resilient soul of this sacred and divine legacy, with a remembering and faithful spirit? A spirit that holds fast with trust. A chilling and awe-inspiring tale arises from the annals of time, with a haunting and sacred voice that echoes. Mothers lull their innocent and tender children with haunting and soothing songs of the angel's protective and mighty might, with a comforting and gentle voice that calms with peace. Young soldiers swear allegiance with a steadfast and solemn oath, inspired by the awe-inspiring account of how a single celestial and powerful messenger defeated an entire and formidable army with a single and decisive stroke that strikes with precision. A tale that inspires and uplifts with a motivating and encouraging force that strengthens. The narrative weaves with a reverent and timeless thread that binds with unity. Legacy inspires courage and unshakable faith with a living and eternal hope that endures with perseverance. The air hums with the ancient and resonant scent of history that persists with a lasting and enduring echo that reverberates. A sensory sign of endurance that stands firm with an unyielding and steadfast presence that holds. Does your soul seek to draw courage and inspiration with a seeking and trusting heart from the sacred and holy tale, with a faithful and believing spirit? A spirit that trusts with faith. This legacy is a spiritual and holy heritage that guides with wisdom, a story that instructs with knowledge, a story that lives with vitality through the countless ages with a living breath. The enemy, with a malicious and envious intent that plots with a scheming mind, seeks to erase this legacy with a blotting and destructive hand that wipes. But God, in His infinite and merciful wisdom that overflows with grace and love, preserves it for strength and encouragement with a saving and redeeming grace that upholds. Have you felt the divine and uplifting encouragement in this eternal and sacred witness with an inspired and hopeful heart? An encouragement that uplifts and fortifies with strength. The narrative expands with added richness and depth. Scribes record with a careful and diligent hand that writes. Their words a foundation for faith that builds with a solid base. A faith that grows with a living and thriving root that deepens. The air carries the ancient and fragrant scent of parchment that endures with a lasting aroma. A sensory call to remember with a mindful and honoring spirit that recalls. Part 10, the eternal promise. Stand at the exalted and sacred threshold of God's unwavering and unbreakable promise. A solemn and binding vow for all time that echoes with a resounding and mighty voice that proclaims. A beacon of hope for future generations with a radiant and guiding light that shines with brilliance. This is the eternal promise. The 10th sacred and assuring sign of divine faithfulness extended beyond the boundaries of time, with a covenant that holds fast and endures with strength. Have you ever trusted with a faithful and believing heart, a promise that stretches beyond your fleeting and temporal lifetime, with an enduring and far-reaching grasp that reaches? As if God's sacred and holy word secures your eternity, with a divine and eternal seal that protects. With a guarding hand, Isaiah's prophetic and assuring declaration in Isaiah 37:35. For I will defend this city to save it, for mine own sake, and for my servant David's sake, stands as a solemn and unbreakable vow that assures the defense of Jerusalem with a protective and unyielding shield that guards. a sign for all nations to behold with awe and reverence, with a witnessing and seeing eye that marvels, a sign that comforts and sustains with a nurturing embrace. Your faith rests in this eternal and unshakable care, with a resting and peaceful place that shelters with safety, a place that holds. Can you feel the guiding and enveloping assurance settling over your soul, with a comforting and protective embrace that heals with a soothing touch? An embrace that restores with peace, a narrative crowns with a triumphant and hopeful flourish that rises with glory. Pilgrims on the sacred and hallowed Mount Zion pause with attentive and listening ears that hear, hearing the faint and mysterious sound of invisible wings, with a whispering and gentle rustle that soothes with calm. A tender and loving reminder of God's watchful and protective care over the city he chose, with a divine and holy selection that blesses with favor. The story closes with a harmonious and peaceful chord that resonates with unity. Promise endures with an everlasting and timeless voice that speaks with authority, a voice that comforts with assurance. The air carries a sweet and tranquil scent of peace that calms with a soothing balm that heals, a sensory crown of hope that uplifts with a steady and reassuring hand that guides with direction. Will you cling with a trusting and faithful spirit to this eternal and unshakable promise, with a believing and hopeful heart that trusts, a promise that secures and saves with salvation? This promise is a spiritual and holy anchor that steadies with a firm and unyielding hold that grips with strength, a word that guides through the tempest with a leading and illuminating light that shines with radiance, a word that saves with a redeeming and powerful force that delivers the enemy with a raging and defiant intent that roars with fury, may threaten with a challenging and mocking voice that defies. But God's sacred and holy vow stands firm with an unassailable and victorious stand that prevails with triumph. Have you felt the divine and abiding hope in this eternal and sacred promise, with a hopeful and trusting spirit that endures? A hope that strengthens and uplifts with resilience. The narrative expands with added richness and depth. Isaiah's disciples spread the word with a teaching and prophetic voice that instructs, their guidance a light for future and enduring faith that shines with brilliance, a faith that illuminates with a guiding and eternal beam that leads. The air vibrates with the eternal and fragrant scent of divinity that anoints with a holy and sacred oil that blesses, a sensory call to trust with a faithful and believing heart that holds fast. Conclusion: as we stand at this sacred and exalted threshold of divine revelation and eternal truth, a mantle of divine peace and eternal promise drapes your shoulders with a regal and holy robe that honors with glory. Have you felt the profound and weighty presence of God's protection and the serenity of his everlasting and unbreakable word crown your spirit with a holy and radiant crown that shines with brilliance? Let us pray with a united and fervent voice that rises. Heavenly Father, open our eyes with a seeking and discerning gaze that searches to the mighty and awe-inspiring power of your angels that protect with a guarding wing. Strengthen our faith with a fortified and unshakable spirit that stands in your divine and holy defense that shields with a mighty wall. Guide us with a leading and compassionate hand that directs to trust with a faithful and believing heart your eternal and sacred promises that endure with strength. In the precious and redeeming name of Jesus, our Savior and Lord who saves. Amen. With a holy seal, type 1. Trust in your angels and promises with all my heart and soul below. With a heart fully surrendered and submitted to his divine and sovereign will, with a contrite and humble spirit that bows with reverence, like with a spirit exulting in joy that overflows with praise and thanksgiving that resounds with a joyful sound. Subscribe with a vow of steadfast and unshakable faith that stands firm with resolve and determination, that holds with strength, and share with a hand extended in love and generosity to disseminate this sacred and transformative truth to all corners of the earth with a giving and blessing heart that reaches with grace. May God's peace reign over you through all eternity with an everlasting and triumphant reign that prevails with victory. A peace that surpasses all human understanding and endures forevermore with an eternal and glorious crown that shines with radiance. A peace that crowns your journey as a chosen and victorious one, with a radiant and triumphant end that glorifies with praise.